Okay, so welcome to a lecture here by Kyungmi Shin. And this is a lecture that is sponsored by Institute of Arts and Humanity and Transnational Korean Studies, as well as I think the Department of Visual Art is somewhat kind of also part of it. The title of the lecture is really, really provocative. Citizens, not barbarians. In fact, it's very timely for what's going on, the cultural war in this country these days, what's going on. And I love the title. In fact, it's much better than Build Back Better. So actually, this is also the title that was used for as her recent exhibition that happened just at the very end of last year at a gallery, a solo show at the gallery called Various Small Fire in Los Angeles. And I'm going to kind of, go through maybe a little bit from this wonderful press release that from that exhibition. And so Citizen, Not Barbarians, Kyungmi Shin's first exhibition in this gallery explores her family stories, identities, and migrations by interrogating global colonialism, its relationship to and effect on multiple languages that frame who we are, how we see, and what we do. The exhibition title is quoted from Edward Glissant's Poetics of Relations, where he describes the otherness in its internal and external positionality beyond how it's understood through a Western lens that orders and sustains systematic hierarchy. Maybe I should add somewhat historical history of colonialism, I suppose. Shin's work asks myriads of potent questions surrounding the complex I have a speech problem, entanglement between faith, positions of power, and the exchange and mutation of cultural and intellectual capital between the East and the West. At the center of this work is her parents' background as Korean Christians who immigrated to San Jose, California with Kyungmi and her family when the artist was 19. Shin is interested in the way Christianity was used as a tool of colonization and spread across parts of global South to claim territories and sanctions, the theft of people's land and livelihood, as well as the suppression and erasure of their epistemologies. This obviously suggests from the early days of Spanish conquistadors to founding of this nation through the kind of a rhetorics of the divine providence of Christianity. But I also would add that Christianity also was very successful in Korea, as South Koreans are actually 1/3, 30% Christians. With a focus on opacity, Shin intervenes in layers of paintings and prints that reveal the cultural influence and exchanges that occurs as a result of imperialism. Notably, Christianity itself was first introduced to Korea in late 18th century by Western missionary, a history in some way echoed by immigration story of Kyungmi's father, who continued to preach as Christian minister and share his faith in the United States after arriving California. My computer is not obeying. Without further describing her work, which I assumed that you were explaining about fully, Kyungmi Shin lives and works in Los Angeles, and he's a sculptor and installation artist. He received an MFA from UC Berkeley in 1995, and her work has been exhibited in really amazing exhibition a couple of years ago at the Orange County Museum Art. And furthermore, at the Berkeley Art Museum, Sonje Center, one of the most important contemporary exhibition space in Seoul, South Korea, Japanese American National Art Museum in Los Angeles, Torrance Art Museum. So these are all very effectively in California. Shin's work are in permanent collections of Berkeley Art Museum, Pacific Film Archive, and the Getty Center in Los Angeles. She has received numerous grants, including California Community Foundation Grant, Durfee Grant, Pasadena Art Individual Art Fellowship, and Los Angeles Cultural Affairs Artist in Residence grants. She's mostly known for completing 20 public artworks, including a really amazing public video sculpture that was installed in front of the Netflix headquarters in Hollywood, California. But she's also now increasingly producing work that intended for exhibitions in galleries. So I think now she's about to head toward kind of a parallel roads in her work and her artistic creations. So without further ado, let's give Kyungmi Shin a warm welcome.
Thank you, Kyung, and thank you so much for having me to. I see a little clap icon. Having me to talk about my work, and I'm not very used to talking about my work in a public space such as this. So what I would like to do is, show my images, and I kind of compiled a list of ideas that is interesting. And I just published this small catalog in conjunction with my show at the Various Small Fires, which covers both the exhibit at the Various Small Fires and the show at the Orange County Museum. There was a wonderful writing by Jill Moniz, and also an interview with Sylvie Nachi in the book. So today I was going through the book and kind of also capturing the discussions that I was having with both of these amazing thinkers to kind of create point of departure in my lecture. So what I was thinking I would do is I would just kind of talk briefly about how I began this whole process in the latest body of work, which began about 3 years ago, and then just start a slideshow. So the slideshow will run while I talk about just the various ideas that I'm exploring in the work. So if that makes sense, and at some point, if anybody has a question, you could maybe find a way to raise hand, and if Kyung, if you have any questions, feel free to jump in, and then we'll just try to see how fluid it can be. So this latest series of work, the show that I began with a show I had at the Orange County Museum, and the title of the show was Father Crosses the Ocean. And in that case, when I said father, it was a double entendre, meaning father referencing my father, but also father as in priests who crossed the ocean as missionaries, and kind of their double role or multiple roles that these priests had. So initially, when I had an opportunity to have an exhibit at the Orange County Museum, I wanted to create an exhibit around my father, who had been suffering from Alzheimer's and for a few years by then. And I felt a certain urgency to explore his life or reflect on his life, and started to really look at the family albums and also, visiting him, taking photographs. But as I spent more and more time with my family archive, a lot of the photos that I was looking at were really old images, and I realized these weren't just family photos, but also historical documents. And that really became an interesting turning point for me to think of these as opportunities to talk about not just my family, but Korean families, Korean diaspora and Asian diaspora, and kind of use them as a beginning point to introduce meaningful narratives and discussions, and look at history, art history, and in my personal experience, the history of Christianity as well. So that's how it began. I'm gonna start a slideshow. So let me see if I could figure out how to do this, share screen. So I'm gonna start the slideshow with this Orange County Museum exhibit. Can you guys see the screen? I'm gonna do a slideshow. Hold on. Start this slideshow. So I'm gonna just kind of let's see the different ideas that I was exploring. One of my work is kind of conversions between subjects, such as myself as the maker, my father and mother as the protagonists, and Christianity as both theology and a medium of movement, influence, and colonization, as well as a spatial dimension that contextualizes the liminal state that myself and my parents occupied in relation to the larger cosmological consideration weighing on us. That's actually a quote from Jill from the catalog. And the images that you're seeing here are installation views from the Orange County Museum of Art. So I'm really, in these works, I'm trying to frame complicated narratives by questioning the comparative and binary Western perspective. And one of the as I was building more of these work, and as I getting feedback from the viewers from various exhibits I had, was that especially the Asian Asian American viewers were saying that it was an interesting experience to see photographs that was familiar, as if they were, oh, I think this is the end of this slideshow. Let me go back. I thought they would be looping. To see the Asian images of Asian families represented was something that was really, I think, meaningful for a lot of the viewers. And it was one of the reasons also why it was very important for me to use my family photo archive and kind of work with it as if these are really important historical documents, and juxtaposing them against our historical images, and also kind of thinking of the historical documentations or paintings, and kind of presenting them as a really important and if not heroic, kind of assertive subject matters. So kind of one of the things that I've been thinking about was the idea of shifting the center instead of the Western perspective or Western center, I feel that there has to be these multiple centers, and that the center of perspective of the Asian American perspective or Asian diaspora perspective is really necessary. And I felt like my work can be an opportunity to create that center as well. So let me see if there's other aspect. Like this image is titled, the image that we just saw was titled Lunch on the Grass, and it was a comment on Manet's, of course, or reference, I should say, on Manet's, just another picnic image. I'm going to go back to the Lunch on the Grass. This work was, the title is definitely a reference to the important, art historically important image of Manet's A Lunch on the Grass, and juxtaposed against my family photograph is a painting by Boucher, François Boucher, of a Shinazuri painting, which depicts, it's titled A Chinese Garden. So it depicts a fictional, fantastical kind of an image of a garden scene, a Chinese garden scene of Chinese court. And I like this image, this idea of juxtaposing the fantasy versus reality, the depiction of Asians versus the real kind of photographic rendition of my own family. And because these two different spaces, geographically displaced or separated, also separated by several centuries. And I wanted to kind of create this dialogue between these two scenes. Let's see. So another thing that I was looking at as I was working on this body of work was I'm heavily using a lot of the Shinazuri image. And Shinazuri is the French word that says Chinese, that roughly means, I think, Chinese things. And as many of you might be aware, I think the 18th century was the height of the popularity of the Chinese porcelains and a lot of Chinese goods. The trade with China had started very early, and then one of the earliest porcelain object was brought to Europe by Marco Polo, which is now, I think this little vessel is stored in Venice at a church vault. But so when the trade became really active between Europe and China, when Europe was not able to produce porcelain, China had been making it already for a long time. So the European kind of appetite for this, kind of advanced technology of producing these porcelain objects was something that Europeans really desired. And so a lot of the nobles and royalties were really addicted to collecting these porcelain objects. And by the time they got to Europe, they were very valuable objects. So what happened in Europe, a lot of times, starting I think in France, but all over, they would take the porcelain or a lot of cases porcelain, and then they would add these elaborate Baroque Rococo handle, and kind of taking it away from its original function, because you have to drill holes to these vessels. So you create these Shinazuri objects, and then it becomes a kind of a visual art objects rather than a usable vessels to hold liquid. So that's one of the Shinazuris. Other Shinazuris are the Shinazuri objects or paintings that the Europeans were making, kind of imitating the Chinese style or Asian style objects and porcelain, but also the paintings. There were Shinazuri paintings that were kind of fantastical vision of the East. So a lot of these images are kind of fantasy rather than reality, right? And when I was initially learned about the idea of Shinazuri was when I worked at the Getty Museum in the late 90s. Getty has a really great collection of a decorative art collection from the Louis XIV through later. And so there's a lot of Shinazuri objects. And that's where I learned about Shinazuri. And I thought our existence as immigrants was a bit of a chinoiserie in that it is a mix of different cultural references. So in this series of work, as I was creating these artworks, I wanted to think about this idea of hybridity or kind of creolization of different cultures, and kind of using Shinazuri as a kind of beginning point or another point of departure in addition to my family archive. Let me see if I could go through I think what I'll do is actually, it could be maybe interesting to kind of talk about the works as I'm going through the works. So I'll start with images that was in the exhibit at the VSF. And the work on the left here is was also in the Orange County Museum show, The Lunch on the Grass. And the image on the right, I think I'll have an opportunity to talk about it later, shows a group with my mother, and then a lot of painted elements that shows kind of the totemic Korean as well as Christian iconography. So I'll go to it when I get to the image. This is the largest work in the show, a diptych. Shows myself as a young girl, and juxtaposed against it are various kind of cultural references. On the top layer is this image of like a little deer with a porcelain vessel that holds a very kind of abstracted graphic flower pot. And this is a copy of a element from a Chekari painting from Korea. Chekari is a still life paintings that started in the 18th century. At a similar time, the Shinazuri developed in Europe. And I've seen some some scholars refer to Chekari paintings as Korean Shinazuri as well, because a lot of the Chekari paintings have Chinese porcelain depicted, because these paintings of bookcases were kind of like a portrait of the scholar or the owners, where they're kind of showing off their worldliness by showing a lot of the objects that came from outside. So there's a Chekari element. The two black and white painted birds are Christian iconography. And then the two larger color painting, rectangular paintings are paintings from shaman shrines that shows different deities. These different deities, paintings of these different deities would hang at shaman shrines, or when the shamans go to do the rituals at somebody else's house, they bring a whole bunch of these paintings and hang it, so these deities would be, guiding their spirit. And then on the layers in between these painting is a line depiction done in line. It's a line painting. It's actually painted in silver, and it depicts a scene or a part of a royal carriage. Let me see if I could. Part of a royal carriage that shows, you might be able to show now. Part of a royal carriage that from Portugal, and in those golden, huge carriages has these sculptural element in front, and the purpose of this carriage was to really show off the power of the monarchy. And in this particular one, it had their colonial subjects depicted. So if you look at the left side, you could see an African subject, and on the right side, there is a Chinese subject. So I saw this carriage in Portugal like 20 years ago at the Coach Museum. So when I saw the image first time, it really made a strong impression. And so I had a very kind of funky image of it. And a couple of years ago, we were back in Portugal. I took another photograph of the carriage, and I thought this also, and as a diptych, it kind of was showing the different colonial subjects, and also myself divided in half. And the title, I also put a lot of thought into kind of how to title these pieces. And this piece was titled, it's a soaring vulture, noble eagle, and mourning dove. And it's a quote from The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, where the protagonist is giving a advice to a young person, saying that in life you have a choice to be a soaring eagle, soaring vulture, noble eagle, and a mourning dove. So I thought of different way of being, and also in our cultures, are you the eagle or the dove? Are you the victim? It really made me think a lot about the way of being or choice or a place in life, and kind of having an image of myself as a young person. I thought about kind of that, thinking about those possibilities, was an interesting way to title it. But also in this piece, I am kind of having these two different kind of spiritual practices collide, right? This Christian images as well as the Korean shaman mystic practice. And the question is, why am I dealing with all these two different practices in this image, or referencing those? And I think I'm thinking about different spiritual practices, but I think maybe more Christian practice for me has a lot of kind of problematic relationship in my life. What I think I was kind of longing for, kind of looking for that authentic Korean spiritual experience. And that's why I think I keep going back to shaman practice, because I feel Buddhism also is an imported religion, even though it's been in Korea for over like 1,500 years, 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years for sure. So, so I was thinking about really something that is basic to Korean spirituality, and I thought shaman practice is probably as close as it gets. So that's why I'm kind of mining the shaman practice as well as the kind of folk narratives.
Forgive me, sorry to interrupt, but I think you're moving something on the table when you talk.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's creating very loud noise over here.
Oh, sorry about that. I have my notes.
Yeah.
Against the computer.
Right. If anybody's listening with their headphone, it's going to be a little too loud.
Sorry about that, guys.
Somebody destroy somebody's ear drum. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No worries. So this one I talked about. This image is starts with the family portrait. It's actually not all four of us. It's when there were just two of us, myself and my younger brother, and my father and my mother. I wanted to kind of have a family portrait and be able to kind of juxtapose these different narratives. Underneath the family portrait, there is a Shinazuri painting. It's a painting on silk that also depicts a family. So this is kind of the depiction. I think this European artist's rendition of a Chinese family. And then my own family. And in the landscape, in the Shinazuri painting, if you look at it, there's a really interesting pastiche of different landscape, like pine tree is behind a palm tree. So they're just kind of sticking together these different exotic plants in the landscape. So it kind of shows the fantastical fantasy part of that. At the center is a tiger, and I've been looking at a lot of kind of rendition paintings of the Korean tigers, and this is one of the really wonderful folk painting that depicts a tiger, a Korean folk painting that depicts a tiger, and I wanted to juxtapose against this image. This one is titled Boomerang My Expectations. And it's juxtaposing again, I'm juxtaposing images of a painting that depicts a Chinese style pagoda at a British park. It's a Chinese style pagoda, but it's actually designed as a music stand. So there's at the opening of the scene, there's a crowd gathered underneath in color. It's kind of hard to see because I have a painting layered over on top. And the photograph that I have juxtaposed against it is a group of men, including my father. It's like my father and his colleagues, I think young Christian ministers. They are on some sort of a field trip to Gyeongju, which is a historical city in Seoul, in south of Korea, where it's about 1300 years old, very, very old capital of one of the kingdoms in Korea. And this tower is a very famous historical tower, stone tower. And I was interested in juxtaposing these two towers, again, kind of the narratives about Asia and the fantasy, and the kind of how this tower was probably a Buddhist tower. And now for even Koreans, these are in a way a kind of sightseeing sites. It's not something that is part of a everyday life, unless you're practicing Buddhist. And so these two scenes are separated again by time and space. And the line, overall, there's a line painting that goes over all of the surfaces, and those are kind of a juxtapositions of collage that I have created from these drawings of different monsters from medieval manuscript, a Christian medieval manuscript. Let's see the installation view from VSL. Let's see if it has this one. I have a better, larger image, so I'll go back to the image. This work is actually the first painted photo work that I made in the series. It shows my father sitting on his couch at home, and as my father was developing the Alzheimer's, he would sit kind of, I think he was trying to kind of, compose himself or not lose his composure. So he would be sitting like that when we visit him, and he's always dressed in suit, all his life. He gets up and he'll get, put on his suit. So I felt like this very elaborate Baroque style furniture that they owned since the 90s, which in the 90s in Korea was very popular to own this kind of Italian revival style sofa. So this was one of my parents' prized possessions. So my father sitting and it felt like he's sitting on his throne and trying to kind of capture himself and his memories. And so here I'm juxtaposing against that Baroque sofa. Behind him is again image of the same image that I used with myself in a larger work, is the image of the detail of the carriage, Portuguese carriage that shows African and Asian Chinese subjects here. And in the far background, I have I created a pattern by repeating a Shinazuri painting that I photographed at the Decorative Arts Museum in Paris. It's a Shinazuri painting that shows a garden scene. So kind of this layering of different images and different narratives, but I also wanted to create this relationship. It's as if these, the line painting that depicts this colonial carriage is talking to, as if it's growing out of this sofa. And I was really fascinated by this, 1990s sofa is so harmoniously blending into this, carriage. I actually don't have the dates for this carriage in my head, but I think it's early days of colonizations when Portugal had power. So it's, I don't know, maybe 18th century. Baroque. It looks very Baroque, and it says a lot about the taste and how the Western taste, influence of the Western taste in the Eastern psyche. And I thought that was really kind of interesting dialogue that gets created by this juxtaposition. Just looking at the time. Do you have 10 more minutes or something, Kyung?
You have 10 days.
So this is the image I think in the gallery installation image, I think we looked at the smaller image of this. The background image is a kind of landscape with figures photograph. There are a group of women and a child, and one of the women is my mother. And I thought this image was very interesting because the fact that they decided to kind of sit in this kind of forest and take a picture. It looks like it's a sort of an outing. So made me think about the idea of kind of leisure and the kind of the idea of idealization of nature. And I think, the Korea and China, the Eastern countries have this also relationship to landscape and the landscape paintings, and the West also definitely has its own set of relationships and kind of how you enjoy nature or how you engage with nature. So I thought this image was really poignant, and again, kind of juxtaposing that image against a Shinazuri painting that shows a fictional Chinese family enjoying nature in a slightly different fictional kind of setting. And then all the painted elements are from Korean folk paintings. The tigers, the birds are from the same painting of the tiger painting. And then on the upper left corner of this rectangle is a monster from a medieval or manuscript painting. And then the ropes are from the kind of referencing the shaman, the ropes that are used in shaman trees, in the shaman, I don't know how to translate it into English, but in the Shindang, it's called the house where shamans reside. The trees nearby, they put the ropes around those trees. So those ropes are referencing those ropes. And this is, I also started a series of image using this one particular image of my mother. It's a very tiny, actually, almost looks like a contact print of my mother. who is standing on a rocky beach in Busan. And she was at this time working as an assistant minister. So she's a single woman, very unusual, like a woman born in the 30s, but she's late 20s, unmarried, has a career, and she's looking very confident. And when during the pandemic, all this violence against Asian, and when the shooting happened in Atlanta, killing, I think, 6 women, Asian women, it made me kind of, I think all of us were in deep shock. And I wanted to kind of address that or think about the idea of perception of Asian women. So I started to kind of juxtapose the depiction of Asian women in our history. So in this one, the image in the back is, the background is Go Gang's lover, and juxtaposed against a photograph of my mother, Shinazuri painting. The pattern is from a Shinazuri wallpaper pattern again, and then Getty painting elements and tiger, Korean folk tiger. Arrow. So another image here. This is not a depiction of Asian woman, but this is Modigliani's nude, juxtaposed against my mother. Again, painted elements of Getty. I took fertility symbols from Getty paintings, which involves a lot of it's a lot of fruits with a lot of seeds are in Getty paintings as a fertility kind of symbols. And I thought the juxtaposition against with the Modigliani's nudes and the peaches was fun. And here I'm juxtaposing my mother's image against a Turkish bath. It's a kind of vision or the fantasy of Asian women hanging out in private like this, of Western thinking. I thought was very funny. Again, more Getty paintings and shaman ropes. This one, I am juxtaposing my mom's portrait with Jeanne d'Arc. This particular one is a depiction of Jeanne d'Arc from a medieval manuscript. And I wanted to create these juxtapositions that talk about the power, women's power as well. So, and this one is juxtaposed against a inverted image of Artemisia Gentileschi's beheading of Judith beheading of the Holofernes, a biblical story of this woman, powerful woman killing this villain. And this, we talked about this earlier, a larger image, a detail of my portrait, self-portrait. Yeah, so these are actually some, this image wasn't in the show, was made for the show, but didn't make it to the show, but it's a juxtaposition. In the later part of the series of work, I started to make kind of works focused on the images of leisure and kind of just having fun. And I wanted to kind of have these images of, Asian, group of Asians just relaxing or having fun. And I thought this was really fun kind of image of people cheering and my father's looking at you straight. And the background is a painting or actually copy of a drawing that I painted over, which is another copy of I think about Watteau, painter Watteau. And the color painted elements are various kind of monsters or characters from Korean shaman shrines again. So these are different kind of, deities that have different powers. And the black and white animal that you see in the bottom left is a shaman painting, and I had worked with a few friends to try to translate the Chinese character, and it says this creature is from the south of river, and if you consume this this animal, you will be cured of pandemic. So I made this painting before I actually understood the meaning of this, and I thought it was very interesting timing to have a COVID cure in this painting. See the detail of that.
Maybe the COVID started with that painting. Not from Wuhan, so.
But it also tells you about how the pandemics existed. My stepmother was talking about how during the Korean War, there was a huge pandemic of either typhoid or like people were, it was during the war, all these refugee camps were being ravaged by kind of, this pandemic sweeping through. So it's, pandemic had, really been a part of human history as well, right? So
yeah,
that
I actually showed, I think was, I don't know, in my class this week, a scene of the Korean War where American soldiers were spraying DDT.
on people?
Yeah, directly into people in Korea.
Wow.
Yeah, because of the, maybe it's the, pandemic you're talking about. But I was
During
shocked.
the war, apparently there was a
Yeah,
pandemic.
I was shocked that they were just like spraying inside clothes,
Wow, yeah.
directly, DDT.
I mean, there's definitely that discussion about the Barbarian, right? Looking at the
Yeah, I mean, in fact, it was
cultures.
funny because I mentioned that when I was showing that to my students, I was saying that they were spraying these, DDT onto Koreans as if Koreans were like animals, cows.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is the kind of not, I'm sure not everyone, but that is sometimes the perspective by.
We were the barbarians.
Exactly.
Back then, before we became K-pop celebrities.
So I think that pretty much, I think I could wrap up. I think it's about 15-minute mark, and I would end on this image. A picnic scene with a still life of fruits from Korean checkered paintings. I've kind of created assemblage of different fruits and edibles, almost like offerings to this group of people picnicking. So that's it.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much for showing your amazing work. Does anybody have any questions that you would like to know about what's going on in her head? Well, if there, let me maybe then I would start moving discussion. I would start first. I mean, there's, one question that I have is that that you have, this is something maybe that you new to you, was that to use your private, as life, family images into making of artwork, right? Mm-hmm. But you're also projecting in many ways upon a subject that so many more people, so many families, so many Korean Americans here, and so many other Asian Americans here could actually very much relate to, mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Many of us went through similar kind of a experience of displacement or assimilation or segregation or, overall, a transition, living in a different context, right? Right. And so it is a public issue, and how that you, what made you decide to project something from your private world into the public? And then my other question would be that, you have used images from different sources, from paintings of different time, of different important artists, from manuscripts of, publications of religious documents in the past. And so you're combining the idea of photograph with paintings. And what, as artistic practice, how was that experience to you? What did, how that combination of those things and creating also layer is another technique that is very strong. And how did they, let's say, I don't know, liberate is the right word, but it gave the kind of a creative impulse to making of your work?
I think the photograph, I spent a lot of time thinking about how to kind of create this narrative or images, or as I was, composing these images. And one of the ideas was I just paint everything as painting versus using photograph in conjunction with painting. And I always kind of come back to using the photographs again. And I think there's a particular need for that because I am using actual photographs, and I felt like using the photographs was important as photographic image, not as a painting of a photograph. So that, and then, layering on top of that are painted kind of interventions. And I think I just see a question. I just see a question that that came up in the chat that says, "How did you come to develop this way of working?" Is that I didn't really know exactly how to go about achieving what I wanted to do, and I think it was really a trial and error of trying a lot of different things. And I think I kind of came to this, but before this, I've also, in 2000s, I think between 2000, 20 years ago, I was doing a lot of photographic work, kind of more of a performative kind of documentary way. I was using photographs. I have a long history of using photograph in my work. And I also had a series where I painted on photographs for a few years. So that was one thing. And then I had another few years of cutting photographs. And then another few years of creating photo collages as cut photos, like stacked on top of each other into various sizes, including very, very large mural scale sizes. So, and then I think the latest work I did before this series was working on a mural, ceramic mural for Bart. But in terms of visual layering, I think that Bart project I did, which I actually had a huge kind of a production at the studio, trying to create these huge murals in ceramic. The visual layering in that work had a lot of this type of layering. I think I may have kind of developed that sensibility working on the Bart image. The image that I made, the mural that I made for the Bart had layering of the original bottom layer was a pastel painting that I very abstracted, and then I overlaid a satellite image of the area, and then I kind of created it into a drawing. And then on top of that, I also drew roads and things like, so there are all this layering of images. And then on top of that, I layered buildings, which I cut into a shape. So the windows, and you could see the landscape through the windows and frames of the house, which was a bit of a production nightmare, because how do you do that, especially in ceramic, right? You have to do all that. So like glazing was such a challenging part, but that kind of layering and creating transparency to be able to have layers of things on top, I think really kind of a Bart project in retrospect was kind of using this type of idea of layering things to put the idea or narrative on top of another idea. So it was a bit of an organic of kind of growth of all this different techniques I've been using in my work, as well as I think kind of my relationship to the photographic media. I'm kind of, as a sculptor, I think I was very aggressive in using photograph as almost like a material rather than just a surface that records an image. So I think that's where I think came to kind of create this way of layering. And I think in the writing in the catalog, Jill talks about how the kind of maybe my sensibility as a sculptor, these images has a very kind of a dimensional sculptural kind of presence. So, which I thought was an interesting analysis.
Right. If I interrupt that, just to other people to know, when BART is the rapid transit system in Bay Area, and you did a large, huge ceramic mural in one of the stations. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, it's El Cerrito del Norte station, which is one of the transit hubs. It's a really big station where all the buses and they were doing expansion.
Actually, should we try to answer Matthew's question?
I think that's, I was kind of answering his question, I think.
Okay.
What I talked about.
Oh, you were answering his question, not my question? Okay, that's all right.
Because your question and his question was actually,
yeah, I know. I'm just.
There was a huge overlap. Yeah, so I just.
Anybody else would like to ask something to Kyungmi?
I have a question. Thank you so much for your talk. And I find the layering super interesting, for the lack of a better word. I look forward to seeing your work in person, but I think I missed the show, right? At the small fires. Yeah.
Closed 2 weeks ago. I think, yeah.
But,
yeah.
I'd love to see that in person, but if you could tell us more about your experience as a Korean American, Asian American artist, kind of navigating the art world in the US. So
where do we start?
I know, I just started laughing. I know. So if you could, I guess, and also as a female artist, yeah, I'm really curious how you navigated that scene. And really, I mean, clearly there's stamina involved. I mean, you're dedicated to your work. But I'm really curious.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's a very important question, but it's not an easy question to answer, because I think when I began my artistic practice, like I feel like my first kind of serious work that I did was actually using family photographs also. So like almost 30 years before grad school, like my mom had passed away in the mid 80s, and so late 80s and early 90s, I started to kind of make a series of work using photographs of my mother. And I think it was just, I wasn't even sure if it was art. It was more about kind of really investigating her life, and the photographs were kind of the clues for me to investigate that. So at the time I was really influenced by Boltanski, and so about memory. And so I was trying to create works using photographs in a meaningful way. And when I went to grad school and postgraduate school, I think I became, and then in grad school, my work was really about actually investigating Christianity, and I was making sculptures with candy, religious objects with candy and things like that. But more and more, I think my work became a little bit more conceptual, and I wanted to also make work that was more universal, or I just became more interested in this kind of various conceptual ideas. So I was making all these different works, and it kind of evolved over time, but I didn't have much critical success. And I think the first 15 years out of graduate school, or like I should say about 10, 12 years, it was a lot of struggle in terms of trying to see how my artwork fits into the art world, because there was no critical or financial success. So I was kind of, teaching. And so at some point I started to shift my focus into making public art, because I think that's a way for me to have a full-time art practice without teaching. And I felt like maybe it's a little fairer because it's like a lot of these are very competitive, but it is actually a competition. So you submit your portfolio and you're a finalist, and you create an idea. And if your idea is good, hopefully your work is selected. And of course, there are biases also. So I actually formed the Shin Gray Studio using both my husband and my name. So it sounds more like a studio and not some Asian women artists. So like if I'm going to a Midwestern, little city, they won't feel kind of intimidated by my foreign, name or something. So I don't know if it worked, but that was one of the strategies I kind of used. But it took a long time to kind of, gain attraction. And towards the end of that 13-year cycle, I made some kind of large works that are really wonderful as well. But I feel like I've kind of tried different things to try to navigate kind of being an artist and kind of survive as an artist, I think. And looking back, I'm realizing, I'm sure there are so many different forces and reasons for the success or lack of success, right, in my career. And I think now I feel like I don't have time to waste. That I'm at a point where I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to be 60 in 2 years and I have no time to waste and no excuses. So I have a certain urgency. It's like, I really want to make some good works and have it shown. And so I kind of last 3 years has been with some help with great friends who are curators who gave me opportunities to show. So I really took those opportunities and decided to kind of make a series of work that was meaningful for me. But I feel like it's really taken me a long time to really claim this kind of space to create works that is really meaningful for me. So I don't know if it answered some of your question, but that was how I navigated.
It does. I mean, if no one else has any question, I have another question. And that's more about your artistic practice and choices that you make when you're making your work. I'm curious about the layering and how I feel like a lot of the portraits, the line drawings of, I wouldn't say drawing on lines of silhouettes of the portraits from your family archives, the way it's overlaid with other images. And I'm curious about your decision making of the sizes, the where they occupy in space, rather than, let's say, because I know that some of the portraits of your mother, they're like different variations, they're lines, and then I could see a seemingly photographic image, which I really can't tell looking at the screen. And thinking about, because personally, I find it really difficult to address my own family archive. So I find it really interesting the way you addressed it in this work. So I'm really curious about that decision-making while you're making this work.
Yeah, I think the way I'm using the photographs from my family archive is, at this point, I don't even look at it as a personal record. And actually, except for the couple of images, like I'm not even represented. And in a lot of images, my family is not even in there, or my father is in a lot of them, but not in necessarily all of them. So I am looking at these as a record, actually, and how people are recording these events and what does that mean? Why are these events recorded? And kind of looking at the kind of social meaning of that more than anything. So that's one way I'm kind of using these images. In terms of making choices of layering, it is really not, I don't really have a clear reasoning or strategy. I think it is experimentation of doing a lot of different things until something works, and then the meaning kind of comes afterwards. And usually, so the visual kind of sensibility and visual meaning decision comes before I can kind of decipher what it means altogether. And I think now I've had developed a body of work. I'm jumping into the next body, but as a continuation from here, my struggle now is like, I don't want a formula, right? I want it to be a surprise to myself. So how do I learn from this body of work and move forward? I still create a new kind of expression or a new way of kind of creating works. So it doesn't become kind of stale and, reused or recycled. So
That's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question that you asked. I mean, I feel I'm probably not correct, but Kyungmi's work is really now, blossoming, and her work is really greatly appreciated and getting the recognition that she deserved. And I think it's providing her a great fuel to, to be even more creative in, her years that she has ahead of her. And maybe that it is also kind of, let's say, if I'm, maybe perhaps generalizing, but, it's a story of the minorities and the others, of all, not only Asian Americans, but African Americans and Latinx people, other so-called people of color, that who has to work harder and longer and persevere.
yeah.
It's not fair, but that's the kind of reality. But it also offers this tremendous motivation to prove that people are wrong, about, who we are. In fact, the title, Barbarian, Citizen, Not Barbarian, is really about that. And, a huge question that you asked was the question that the first part of my question, I'm glad you asked, was that this layering of, besides that, that she feels that confident and generous to offer private world life to, to the public world. At the layering of these images, like, for example, the fantasies that the French culture at their height of their, hegemony of culture at that time, about East and particularly China. At that time, they probably didn't, they knew, actually, the name Korea comes from the French, right? And, but their fantasies about the Eastern world and kind of juxtaposing about the fantasies about Eastern people here in America today, particularly she's addressing in some of her work about, Asian women, right? And that she's showing a very real, which is her own life, about the story of immigrant, and that tried to undermine the fantasies of Asians today in contemporary life. And so I think it's a really great constructive opposition to, misunderstanding about who we are, but dealing in it not in a way that is crushingly violent, but in a very subtle, humanist way, which I think the work, that's where the strength of her work and the message that she's projecting from her work to all of us. Anybody else would like to ask a question, please?
Like, in closing, if I can say something, like I was saying a lot about hybridity, and I'm dealing with hybridity in my work, but I think I recently was reminded, like Glissant talks about, instead of hybridity, créolité. It's like a kind of creolization. So like when two different cultures meet, it's not kind of this kind of a mixing, but it becomes it morphs into something else. So I'm thinking about those meeting of cultures, blending of cultures, and how in a way that becomes a stronger kind of a being or a monster or whatever it is. And I think that's something I'm really kind of interested in kind of looking at and investigating.